Just 1 minute. He's having some login difficulty. We'll just check. JP. JP. Call பண்ணா கைட் பண்ணாரு லாகின் பண்றதுக்கு ப்ராப்ளம் இருக்குன்றாங்க. ஓகே. ஒரு நிமிஷம் கூப்பிட்டாச்சு.
I request our delegates to wait for some time. We will be starting soon.
Sir, login பண்ணிட்டீங்களா? Yeah.
80% और नंबर கொடுத்துட்டு ஜாயின் பண்ணிட்டேன் செகண்ட் டாபிக் ஜாயின் பண்ணிட்டேன் அந்த நம்பர் வச்சுக்கோ ஐடி மயங்க் நம்பர் வச்சிருக்கியா அப்படி சொல்லிட்டு அது பேசிட்டு Okay, we can start. I think sir is having some difficulties. Dr. Rajesh Rajendran, you can join us for chairperson.
Rajesh.
Yes, sir.
Rajesh, good morning.
Okay, Deepika, you start. Yes.
No, 1 minute. I will give a brief introduction, then you can introduce Dr. Vijay.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
A very good morning to all. I welcome back our delegates for today's session. So let us start with our first session on bone. I welcome our chairpersons for this session, Dr. Sridhar and Dr. Rajesh Rajendran. Dr. S. Sridhar, sir is HOD in the Department of Diabetes and Endocrinology at MIOT International, Chennai. Sir is affiliated to various prestigious societies like ACE, ADA, Endocrine Society, ESI, ESD, and RSSDI, and has won the best winner, and sir is the winner of the Best Doctor Award from Dr. MGR Medical University in the year 2012. Sir was the past president of Endocrine Society of Tamil Nadu, and sir has 26 publications to his credit. Our second person is Dr. Rajesh Rajendran. Sir is consultant in endocrinology and diabetes at Rajendran Hospital, Alandu, Chennai. Sir is an excellent academic and clinician with an impassable record. He did his DM from Stanley Medical College, Chennai. Subsequently, he completed his training in internal medicine and diabetes and endocrinology in the UK. He has over 18 years experience and has worked in several reputed NHS institutions in England and Scotland. He has published over 25 articles in international journals and authored several book chapters. He has been the recipient of several awards for his research in diabetes and endocrinology in UK. Welcome, sir. Over to the chairpersons.
Good morning. I welcome all of you for yet another exciting session of this very fabulous conference. And we straight away start like in T20, we start with a 6. We start with a very controversial topic, the calcium controversy. The actual controversy with the calcium came because many areas in North America where vitamin D levels are low and the calcium intake is high seem to have high prevalence of osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease. And randomized controlled trials have suggested that vitamin D can be given as a bolus, calcium has to be given daily and is poorly tolerated. The NHANES data found that even normal levels of calcium in men and little higher levels of calcium in women are associated with increased cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. And of course, we know that excess calcium intake can not only have problems with the heart, can lead to conditions like nephrolithiasis, etc. So, how much to take? How long to take? And the present randomized control trials are weak in design, and there are no, as far as I know, no new RCTs are in progress regarding this. Women's Health Initiative, which sort of dealt a fatal blow to estrogen supplementation in postmenopausal women, had a subgroup which they compared the calcium versus placebo. And the cardiovascular mortality was 3.2% in the calcium group and 3.1% in the placebo group. So again, it was not big difference. So far, the data has shown that calcium supplementation is useful only in osteoporosis. In fractures. It has no beneficial data in osteoporosis and conflicting data in cardiovascular disease. I now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Rajesh Rajendran, for a few words and also to introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, sir. As Sir has rightly pointed out, calcium has remained a topic of controversy, and I suppose it will remain a topic of controversy for another few years until we have more clarity on the benefits and the harmful effects. Now, today we have a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Vijayaskar Reddy, who is also our organizing secretary for TENDO 2020, to enlighten us on this topic. He needs no introduction. Obviously, he is one of the most renowned endocrinologists from Pondicherry. He has organized this TENDO 2020 so beautifully, and he is the president of the Pondicherry Diabetes Research Forum. And needless to say, his publications in endocrine journals are several and excellent. So without much controversial topic, thank you, sir.
Thank you, chairpersons, for the kind introduction. I'll be talking on this topic, calcium controversy. Slides are visible?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Slides are visible now.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
The topic for today is the calcium controversy. Actually, Dr. Sriram Mahadevan had agreed to give this talk, but because he's not here, I'm giving this talk. So, agenda for today is I'll discuss in brief about the role of calcium in the human body. What are the benefits of calcium supplementation, and what is the controversy, and what are the conclusions regarding this controversy? So we know that calcium is the most abundant mineral in the human body, and most of the body calcium exists as calcium hydroxyapatite. And calcium hydroxyapatite is like a lattice-like crystal in the form of So calcium is the most abundant mineral in the human body. 99% of the body calcium exists as hydroxyapatite. And calcium hydroxyapatite mainly exists in the bone and the teeth. It's a lattice-like crystal. It gives strength to the tissues. So structural support to the bone and teeth is the main function of the calcium. The remaining 1% of calcium exists in extracellular fluid and various intracellular tissues. The extracellular fluid calcium has got various functions, although it's only 1% of the calcium. It regulates various processes. So we know that calcium is very important for the muscle contraction, and dilatation. It's also very important for the vascular tone, nerve impulse transmission, cellular signaling, second messenger, ATP production, hormonal secretion. So we can all see that these are all very important processes in the human body, and calcium plays a major role in various parts. The normal values in adults for the calcium, serum calcium is 8.8 to 10.4 milligram per deciliter. Always calcium, we know that it is controlled by vitamin D and parathormone, so we have to correlate with that. Ionized calcium is useful in hypoalbuminic states like patient in ICU or patient liver disease or nephrotic syndrome where the serum albumin is very low. The benefits of calcium, for a long time we've been using calcium and vitamin D. They're very important for bone health. It's an important public health initiative to reduce fracture risk. So whenever we think of bone, we always give calcium and vitamin D supplementation. So it's well recognized. Although calcium is very important for bone health, calcium deficiency is very common in the diet. Even the countries, well-developed countries like USA and UK, calcium deficiency is very common. More than 50% of adults, especially older women, internationally, they take calcium supplements. And because of this, we can see that nearly 50% of older women are already taking calcium supplements. Safety must be established regarding the calcium supplementation. So you can see that if your friends or any relatives are coming from US, we can see them bringing big boxes of calcium along with them. So if they're going to take as over-the-counter medicines, so in the long run, we need to ascertain the safety of this calcium supplementation. But although for our population, they think that these are all only mineral tablets, vitamin tablets, so they will not cause any harm. But safety must be established. This is a publication in the Indian Express, which showed that Indians consume far too less calcium than required. So they estimated, according to this study, they estimated that the calcium intake was only 400 to 500 milligram per deciliter as against recommended of around 1000 milligram per day. This is data from the NIN showing which are the calcium rich products. All of us know that it's mainly the milk and milk products, milk, curd, paneer, and then we have some grains which have a significant amount of calcium. These are all various rajma, ragi, they contain calcium. Some vegetables, they contain a lot of calcium like fenugreek leaves. Then we have broccoli. This is data from the NIN. We also have calcium in the form of supplements as tablets in India. We have various formulations, calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate, calcium citrate. Among these, carbonate and citrate are most commonly used. Calcium carbonate is the cheapest and most commonly used. And calcium citrate is slightly more expensive. Calcium... Good morning, sir. Welcome, sir.
Good morning. Good morning. Join you guys.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So we're going on to the first talk. You can join us, sir.
Sure. Okay. Right.
So calcium carbonate is the most commonly used, and calcium citrate is also used in Indian setting. So coming to the controversy, we know that calcium is good for the bone, but as Dr. Sridhar sir, our chairperson, showed that there are some studies showing that it can be bad for the heart. However, studies are very variable results. The controversy comes in that the benefits clearly proven with regards to risk of fracture reduction, and some studies showing reduction in the cardiovascular events and some studies showing increase in the cardiovascular events. The experimental data is lacking for risk. And then we know that more calcium supplements, they can have kidney stones, and calcium carbonate can cause indigestion and GI diseases. So this is, there are advantages and disadvantages, there are benefits and risks. So the main controversy came with the initial studies in 2008 and 2010. They're showing that the healthy older women receiving calcium supplementation, MI was reported more common in the calcium group. This was one study which showed that, and was statistically significant. And another RCT of calcium supplementation in healthy non-osteoporotic older men showed a non-significant but adverse trend in CV endpoints. And then there was a meta-analysis in 2010, which showed around 5 studies showing 31% increase in EMI. So this is where the caution came in, why it's going to cause extra cardiovascular events. Although the studies came out, but the studies had severe limitations and criticisms. None of the trials had CV outcomes as primary endpoints. Primary endpoints were actually fracture, BMD, like that. But it's very difficult to assess cardiovascular outcomes in this. There is inconsistent validation or potential bias in CV event ascertainment. And there is lack of information because they're all bone studies. From there to assess the cardiovascular outcomes was very tough. And most of the trials excluded calcium plus vitamin D trials. One postulated mechanism how calcium supplementation can lead on to increased cardiovascular risk is logical in that the calcium can get deposited in the coronary arteries. This is the coronary artery calcium, which we can see in the CT scan. And here we can see the carotid intima medial thickness showing calcium deposits. Although this mechanism is established, but what is the role of calcium in coronary artery disease? What causes coronary artery disease? We know atherosclerosis causes coronary artery disease. Why does calcium get deposited in coronary arteries? What is the role of calcium in coronary artery plaques? Does calcium cause coronary artery disease? Does increased calcium lead to coronary artery calcium? So many questions remain unanswered. This is the normal progression of atherosclerosis. We have normal plaque. So this is a normal artery, coronary artery, and then we have the fatty streak, and then we have the atherosclerotic plaque. We can have intraplaque hemorrhage, and later stage, actually calcification is a response and not a cause of coronary artery disease. That is why calcium, whether it really causes through coronary artery calcification, is not well established. The newer randomized trials meta-analysis, this is the study of the meta-analysis, collaborative meta-analysis in 2016-2015 of various trials of calcium supplementation on verified coronary heart disease hospitalization. The previous studies were actually bone studies and BMD studies where the cardiovascular outcomes were not primary outcomes, whereas here we have clear-cut data of the coronary artery disease hospitalization, death in postmenopausal women. Here, clearly, the calcium supplementation was neutral. There was no increase in the cardiovascular events. The hazard ratio was 0.96, which was reassuring. So the calcium intake and CV disease risk, the updated systemic review and meta-analysis is no statistically significant differences in risks of CVD events or mortality between calcium and vitamin D compared to placebo. There is no increase in CVD mortality and stroke. There is no consistent dose-response relationship to establish causality between calcium supplementation and coronary artery disease. There is no dose-response relationship. So the recent meta-analysis and systematic review seems to give a clean sheet for calcium supplementation. Based on these studies, the National Osteoporosis Foundation and American Society for Preventive Cardiology have given a statement saying that there is lack of evidence linking calcium with or without vitamin D supplementation to cardiovascular disease in generally healthy adults. The expert panel considered the findings of updated evidence, and they also considered animal mechanistic studies, and they showed that there is no detected adverse effect of calcium on coronary artery calcium. There is no established biological mechanism to support an association between calcium and cardiovascular disease, and they gave official statement. So this is a position statement. There is moderate quality evidence that calcium with or without vitamin D from food or supplements has no relationship to the risk of cardiovascular disease or mortality. In light of evidence available to date, calcium intake from food and supplements that do not exceed the tolerable upper limit of intake, like more than 2000 milligram per day, can be considered safe from the cardiovascular endpoint. This is a position statement from the National Osteoporosis Foundation. A recent publication, Atherosclerosis, calcium supplements good for the bone, bad for the heart, a systematic updated appraisal. Here they have classified from calcium supplements from outside the calcium tablets versus dietary calcium. What they have come to conclusion is the calcium in the form of supplements like calcium carbonate and calcium citrate, we can see that there is rapid increase in the calcium, the rapid rise in the calcium in the bloodstream, which can lead on to calcification in the blood vessels. Whereas the dietary calcium, the calcium absorption is very slow and smooth. The calcium doesn't get deposited in the blood vessels. So their recommendation is, as far as possible, we need to encourage our patients to get all the calcium through their diet in the form of milk and dairy products and some cereals like grains like rajma and ragi, rather than going for calcium supplements. If the patient doesn't take enough calcium in the diet, then we can go on to calcium supplements. They've clearly demonstrated that dietary calcium has got a much smoother peak and slow rise. Thereby, the calcium deposits are much lesser. Adequate calcium intake through diet is associated with protection from coronary artery disease, whereas calcium supplements can lead on to rapid rise in the calcium level in the bloodstream, and it can lead on to coronary artery disease. However, they also recommend that if the patient is not taking enough calcium through the diet, some people have got lactose intolerance or they do not like dairy products. In such case, we can give calcium supplements, but not more than 500 milligram calcium in a single dose. So what does this all mean in clinical practice? So we talk a lot of things. So what do I do? What is relevant in clinical practice? So I already told, dietary calcium is better than calcium supplements. The recommended intake for calcium in adults, 50 years and younger, 1000 milligram per day, and older people, they require around 1200 milligram per day. And vitamin D also has to be supplemented separately, and various guidelines across the world recommend around 1000 milligram of calcium per day, preferably in daily doses. So the position statement from National Osteoporosis Foundation is, obtaining calcium from food sources is preferred. Supplemental calcium can be added on topped up to make any shortfall in dietary intake. If the patient guarantees that they can take enough calcium in the diet, we don't need to give supplements. Previously, there were it was that all postmenopausal women should take calcium tablets, all thyroid patients should take calcium tablets. Now that is not there. So if the patient should assess a calcium intake through the diet, if the calcium intake through the diet is satisfactory, then we do not need to give calcium supplements from outside. Many patients will ask, sir, you're not giving me calcium tablet, I'm menopausal. So we can say that we assess your dietary intake. If your calcium intake through diet is sufficient, you don't need to take calcium supplements from outside. The National Osteoporosis Foundation also recommends the same. Obtaining calcium from food sources is preferred. Supplemental calcium can be safely used to make up any shortfall in the dietary intake. Discontinuation of supplemental calcium for safety reasons currently is not necessary, especially may be detrimental to bone health in situations where intake from food is suboptimal. We need to try to aim to reach but not exceed the recommended intakes. Thank you. If any questions, we can take up here itself.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay Bhaskar Reddy, for a very clear and very lucid elucidation of the calcium controversy. There's one question in the chat box. Yes. I think you also already told about it regarding lactose intolerance patients. How do you manage? You want to talk about it again?
So I think lactose intolerance patients, we cannot use milk and dairy products. So there are other types of milk like soya milk, other options are available, or they can use any of the calcium supplements like calcium carbonate or calcium citrate.
So how do you assess persons taking adequate calcium so that is going to rely only on his history, or is there any other way?
So I think history will be the main. So the National Osteoporosis Foundation, they have got the calcium intake score. So they have various products, but in our practice, mainly milk, curd, and dairy products, cheese, and certain grains. These are the main calcium intake. So if they're taking at least 400 to 500 ml milk or curd per day, I think that will give sufficient calcium. So it has to be through history only. The blood calcium may not show clearly because the serum calcium, even if the calcium intake is less, the bone calcium is mobilized into the bloodstream through PTH secretion.
I had this question, and when Dr. Satish joins me, to ask you which calcium compound you choose. carbonate, citrate, malate?
So calcium carbonate is the most cost effective, and that is what is used most commonly. So that can be used, but if the patient is on proton pump inhibitor, the acid secretion is required. Acid in the stomach is required for calcium absorption. So calcium tablets normally are given just after food intake, so that the absorption is good. If the patient is on proton pump inhibitors or H2 blockers, in such circumstances, calcium citrate malate has got better absorption. Another is if the patient is having gastritis and gastric intolerance, or they have flatulence and indigestion, which is very common in the Indian setting. Most of our patients, even before you ask, they will tell we are having this, we are having chest burning. So in such circumstances, calcium citrate has got slightly lesser GI side effects. Any patient on proton pump inhibitor, H2 blocker, or gastric intolerance symptoms, we can go for calcium citrate. If economical constraints, we can stick on to calcium carbonate.
Dr. Krishna Kumar, you would like to?
Yeah. In my case, a very good presentation by Dr. Vijay.
Yes,
But
sir.
I again like to the same person who just been asked now. I'm seeing on the screen regarding the dietary intake, how to assess exactly, because history is Dr. Vijay says history is the main thing. But can we assess from the history the exact, at least approximately how much a person is getting calcium per day? Is it possible? I don't know.
Yes, sir. The NIN gives clear. The NIN book is there where they recommend, depending on how much milk they are taking, we can milk and curd and dairy products. You can assess. If the patient says, "I don't like the smell of milk. I don't take curd. I don't take any curd products," then it's the patient is not taking any calcium. If the patient is taking only small amount of milk with tea or coffee, which most often our people do like that, then obviously the intake is not enough. So I think as a rough rule, if you take that, if they take 2 glasses, 1 glass is 200 ml, 2 glasses of milk or curd, then I think that is good. I think Dr. Thomas Paul is there. He's worked extensively in calcium supplementation. He'll be able to guide us, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So it's a good question. Actually, we have done calcium, dietary calcium intake studies, which we have published 3 papers on it. Of course, my colleague Suresh was also part of it. He's also in the forum. There are 2 ways, as Dr. Reddy said. We have a Hyderabad National Institute of Nutrition. They have a book. So there are 2 ways of doing it. One is 24-hour recall, which you get what all the things patient has taken, document it. Second, in addition to that, you ask specific questions with relation to dairy products, ragi, and calcium-rich product, how much they have taken in last 24 hours and last 7 days. What we find is last 7 days will be difficult because the memory is less. But most probably, most of the time, we go by the previous day, 24-hour recall, as well as how the calcium rich specifically we'll ask. So this book is available, and that gives each product with relation to South India, North India, Western, Eastern, each food, cooked food, how much calcium it contains. It gives fairly accurate results.
Or instead, should we suggest to the patient, you take this much, like 1 glass of milk or 1 glass of curd?
2 glass milk or curd, 1 glass milk, 1 glass curd. I think 2
We
glass,
suggest to
200
them,
ml. Yes.
like recounting, sometimes our people may not be, very comfortable with all this. I thought,
Yes, sir. I think 2 glass, sir. I think 400 to 500 ml is good. Yes, sir.
Vijay?
You can finish, sir.
Yeah, no. We suggest to them that you take this much. Probably they may follow, most probably.
So we
Give
can
them the
say
suggestion, you follow this.
2 glass per day, sir. 2 glass milk or 1 glass milk and 1 glass curd, 200
Right.
ml glass.
That should be enough.
Yes.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. That's a very good suggestion.
There's
Most of the people will not have any difficulty in following.
Yes.
It should be okay.
There's another question. It's a fairly interesting question. Of course, all of us know an extreme form of vegetarianism, vegan, where milk products are avoided. So what is your approach in this case?
So luckily in our situation, I think most of the vegetarians, their staple food is milk, curd and dairy products. If it's a pure vegan, they're not taking any milk, then we can give the option of soy milk, or they can go for calcium supplements. Calcium is required, they need to take.
Two things again. Can calcium be used with thyroxine, or you have to keep a 12-hour gap? And the second thing, before food, after food, does it make a difference?
Yes, sir. So calcium can block the absorption of thyroxine. So calcium and thyroxine should be taken apart at least 6 to 8 hours, sir, as sir told, preferably 12 hours. Morning thyroxine on empty stomach and calcium at night. That will be the best regimen. And second is calcium absorption is good if taken after food intake. And if the patient is on proton pump inhibitor, better to use calcium citrate than calcium carbonate. Another question is there whether you would prefer calcitriol. Calcitriol should not be used normally along with calcium. That is recommended only for patients with renal dysfunction and hypoparathyroidism patients.
Can I ask a question about whether calcium can cause worsening of reflux symptoms and constipation?
Yes, definitely. Calcium tablets, I think size of the tablets are also quite big. They're very well known to cause reflux symptoms, indigestion, constipation. In such circumstances, we can try to shift over to this calcium citrate. If the patient is still not tolerating, then we have to encourage dietary intake.
Dr. Vinod asks about bioavailability of the various compounds.
So
Calcium.
bioavailability, I think that is not a major of the food sources, sir.
No, not food sources. Calcium compounds, carbonate, citrate, etc.
I think bioavailability, they say is slightly better with calcium citrate, but I think whether it's clinically meaningful or not, that's not known. It's more related to the tolerability and acidity in the stomach.
So, are there any further questions?
I request Dr. Thomas Paul also to clarify in his talk about these issues. Another question is, can calcium supplement be given even though serum calcium is normal? Yes, I think it has to be given. If the dietary intake is poor, we have to start giving from outside, because even if you take less calcium, the bone calcium is mobilized into the bloodstream. So serum calcium will not go down till the last extent. So even if the serum calcium is normal, if the dietary intake is poor, they have to take calcium supplements.
So, I think if there are no further questions, we'll move on to the next program. I thank Dr. Vijay Bhaskar Reddy for this very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Very good presentation, Vijay. Very good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Excellent presentation, sir.
Thank you.
One minute. The next talk is given by none other than Dr. Thomas Paul, who incidentally has just been elected as our president for the Endocrine Society of Tamil Nadu. Again, congratulations to him. He is the professor and head of the Department of Endocrinology, Diabetes and Metabolism, CMC Vellore, and is a known authority on bone diseases. And his area of interest is metabolic bone disease and principal investigator in multiple multi-center trials in osteoporosis. And he will talk about, of course, he is a reviewer in various journals, Endocrine Practice, Osteoporosis International, Indian Journal of Medical Research, Indian Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism, and Clinical Endocrinology. He has as much as 160 publications. He gave the P.N. Shah oration in ESICON in 2017 and the Natarajan oration in JERICON in 2019. He is member of ESI, ISBMR, in fact, the secretary of ISBMR, and member Asia Pacific panel. He will now talk about a very important topic, bone health assessment for general practitioners. Over to Dr. Thomas Paul.
I'll share my screen. Thank you very much, sir. I'll try to share my screen. Screen visible?
Yes, it is.
At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers of this Trendo, Dr. Vijay Bhaskar Reddy and JIPMET team for giving me, and scientific committee for giving me this opportunity to present. Next 17 minutes, I briefly summarize what at the primary care, how do you assess? That's what the bone health has to reach. Not at a tertiary care, many of us, almost all of us do. But a primary care, what are the things to pick up these things with limited resources? So this will be mostly based on our work. And it starts from, like, you know, the more we gain, like, you know, the more we learn. All these conferences help to learn about, like, you know, the knowledge, and we have to practice this. This is very clearly given in Tirukkural. And if you look at the bone diseases spectrum itself, there are so many are there. Like, you know, the common ones are osteoporosis and osteomalacia. And in these other disorders are not very common, but we come across in clinical practice, like hyperparathyroidism. Now, when we look at the longevity, especially in India, like for last 20 years is going up. So many people will live with the diseases like osteoporosis. So it is our responsibility to look at the assessment, then plan treatment to prevent fractures and other disabilities, so that they will be living a healthy life. Now, this is a simple case came to us a few months or 1 year ago. Elderly lady, and she's a postmenopausal. She came, she was on a maximum OHA, and she was advised insulin. She refused. She wanted a second opinion. That's the reason she came. So if you look at this, the history, she's on all the medications. They are just given a brief summary of the medications and current glycemic status. So her question is whether she should use insulin. But when you look at, this is what we shouldn't miss. She has postmenopausal many years, and she has type 2 diabetes. HbA1c is not controlled. She's thin, and she's on pioglitazone, and she also had left forearm fracture. So these risk factors should be captured, and we should plan for initiating treatment for osteoporosis to prevent further fractures. If you look at the prevalence, this study we published last year in 1,500 rural South Indian women from Tamil Nadu, we found that 50% have osteoporosis. And are men are protected? Not so. Yesterday, you would have heard Dr. Seshadri's oration, and there are people, men also, they have osteoporosis more than 20% above 60 years. And we also documented 15% have vertebral fractures. They just ignore as a back pain. So that is very important. So men and women, both. Now, so what? 20% mortality after sustaining hip fracture within 1 year. And the vitamin D deficiency is one of the important factor, especially we have to correct in this age group. Now, this is a study we published last year looking at 220 physicians, primary and secondary healthcare, how much is the knowledge, and we're looking at the various parameters of osteoporosis assessment and treatment, and it was suboptimal. So as I said, at the primary care and secondary care, the important things before jumping into investigation, the assessment is clinical, looking at various factors like advancing age, additional risk factors, offending drugs, dietary calcium, of course, Dr. Vijay Bhaskar told very nicely, and vitamin D, And what about the physical activity? All these factors and risk factors for fall are there. Then that is very important in this, especially elderly people, all postmenopausal women as well as in elderly men. Now, this is a study which we published a few years ago. My colleague Nitin and Kripa did this along with the medical students, and looking at the teeth and assessing the risk of osteoporosis. Very simple in primary care. Just look at it, non-traumatic teeth loss. Somebody has lost all the teeth, then in above 60 years of women, non-traumatic, then the risk of osteoporosis, having osteoporosis in them, is very high. So this is very simple measure. Now, when you look at this is a study which we published at 2 months ago, looking at weight, neck circumference, waist circumference, and predicting osteoporosis. We found that the weight below 45 kilogram, had a high risk for osteoporosis at spine, and the weight was protective. We all know that more obese, this is one disease where they the bone gets protected, not at overt obesity, but they are if they are low weight, it goes for osteoporosis. So we have to think of somebody is underweight, then we have to consider definitely additional risk of having osteoporosis. Now, these are the tools we can use in clinical tools, which we can use in our practice, like SCORE. I'll come to SCORE. OSTA is very simple. Weight minus age into 0.2. So it's very simple. And if you get a value less than -1, or then we know that they are at high risk for osteoporosis. And other tools are there. They can be even our social workers can perform, and they can identify the high risk individual. This is our study looking at 2,000 people and these tools, how they are performing in Indian setting. We found that a tool, risk factor tool, SCORE and OSTA, had performed well. We can use it in clinical setting. Now, when you look at this SCORE, you can do it on a smartphone. Like, just you have to click whether the race, whether the rheumatoid arthritis is present, previous fragility fractures are there, age, previous use of HRT, and weight. It will give you a score. And then based on this score, then we know, our cutoff we take is about 8. Then they are at high risk for osteoporosis. So this is a simple score. We can do it at a bone health assessment for osteoporosis at a primary care. Now, what about men? We did it in elderly men, 500 people. 2 tools we used. OSTA, as I said, OSTA is very simple. Weight minus age into 0.2. So, for example, weight is 40 kilo and age is 60. It is minus 20 into 0.2. Then it is more. It is towards negative. It is more negative. It means very high risk for osteoporosis. There is another tool which we can use in clinical practice is MORS. MORS, especially only for the men. Their COPD present, that is taking into account of smoking, COPD present or absent, then that gives you a valid score. Now, this is what I projected. And these tools, OSTA and MORS, in our clinical practice, in especially primary and secondary healthcare setting, we can use for predicting high-risk people for osteoporosis. These tools performed well in our Indian setting. Now, this we all know, this has been there for last 10 years, fracture risk assessment tool. Once again, it's an online tool. We can use it in the smartphone, and we have to write we have to enter the various risk factors. And we all know that in India, glucocorticoid are used in unauthorized use also there. So that is one history we have to clearly get, and it will give you hip fracture risk and major osteoporotic fracture risk. And we have our own cutoff, and the various countries use this FRAX tool for a different purpose. But India, what we can do, we can look at the absolute cutoff, and we can say, this is a recent study we published last month, looking at our cutoff for predicting prevalent vertebral fractures. we found that major osteoporotic fracture risk in that score, if you enter the risk factor in FracStool and if you find a value more than 9, we can start treatment. We don't even need bone density assessment. With a simple clinical risk factor assessment, we can use this tool. Now, these are the things as a physician we have to be aware. We have to always be aware all these conditions like malignancy, endocrine conditions like hypothyroidism, Cushing's, then drugs, very important, especially glucocorticoid, we all know, and antidepressants and anticonvulsants, especially older ones like phenytoin, phenobarbital, carbamazepine, they can cause problems. Now, the basic evaluation mandatory is a calcium. If you're assessing for a bone health, calcium associated with albumin. And always make sure that when we are doing phosphorus, it should be done on a fasting state. Otherwise, you'll get a wrong value. Creatinine, because renal function can affect, alkaline phosphatase. And because we are all, many of us are vitamin D deficient, it may not be feasible to do vitamin D testing in a primary care setting. So it is not mandatory. We know that bone turnover marker is a dynamic marker. We can test in the blood in a where there is facilities are available, which will tell us how the bone is behaving, more formation or less resorption, or more resorption, less formation. Now, this is the one thing, in this case, we published last year, my student Jinsen and Kripa were active in it. This patient was, you can look at the patient had a severe osteoporosis, and this patient was given bisphosphonate. But one thing they missed was phosphate. The phosphate was low. That was a clue. Then we found there was a phosphaturic tumor on the jaw, and this patient was treated with removal of that tumor, and patient became okay. The moral of the story is, when we are measuring phosphorus, we have to measure on a fasting state. And as I said, vitamin D deficiency is everywhere for last 20 years. This is a study we published last month in 100,000, 1 lakh population who are getting referred to our hospital from various states. 50% have less than 20 nanogram per ml. So in a resource limited setting, we don't recommend testing vitamin D. We have to make sure that we do calcium to rule out hypercalcemia. Otherwise, we can, if hypercalcemia is not there, we can give cholecalciferol to everybody. Now, the bone turnover markers, we have 2, bone formation and bone resorption. We can use it if facilities are available. Now, they have a good correlation with the bone health, especially bone density. We have our own cutoff for our setting. Now, coming to the radiology of this final part of my presentation, X-ray lateral spine gives you lots of information to look at the height of the vertebra and vertebral fracture present or not. So if the DEXA scan is not available, we all know DEXA scan is the gold standard for, but we should do this in a secondary care testing, secondary care or tertiary care. Now, we all know that DEXA scan is a gold standard. We all know that there are certain departments like geriatrics. We have to refer every patient to look at for osteoporosis, and this is the current gold standard. And we use two scores. Elderly people, we use T-score, that is patient's bone density is compared with a young adult. So we take a cutoff of minus 2.5 or less. Then if they are younger individuals, we say Z-score, that is patient's bone density is compared with same age. So we take a cutoff of less than or equal to minus 2. Now, this is for a sample. You can see this patient's total T-score is minus 4.2. Of course, we should see individual vertebra also. This patient is T-score is, we look at the initial details, ethnicity, menopause age, height, weight, everything will be there. And if the patient T-score here is less than minus 2.5, it is minus 4, this patient has got severe osteoporosis. Now, all these machines use Western database, whether as a reference standard, but whether to use Indian database is a big question. we recently found there is a North Indian database available, which can be used as a reference database to diagnose osteoporosis. Now, one thing when you are doing DEXA scan, this is a report which we published recently. My student Pragya and Kripa did this work, and one 90-year-old lady went for a DEXA scan. Look at the T-score; they are all positive. So it cannot be. It cannot be. So we did an X-ray lateral. You can see the calcification. It was falsely high. When we did a lateral DEXA in a selected situation, you can see the T-score. From it is all plus, it has become so much minus. So in elderly people, if you find something plus, you have to be cautious. You have to reassess by a lateral X-ray. In fact, this patient had a fracture in L1 also. Now, other densitometric tools like a microarchitecture assessment, like a TBS, hip geometry assessment, like HSA, all are there, but they are all, it's adjuvant tools. Now, one thing final I want to say is diabetes. In diabetes, falsely BMD will be high. So you may underdiagnose osteoporosis. So you have to be careful. There, you may use a lower cutoff to start treatment. This is a study which we recently did looking at the various parameters scoring tools. So this slide gives, even if you enter bone density in a diabetic person, the risk comes down. So interpret with caution in diabetic subjects, elderly women, when the BMD shows normal, don't take it it may be still osteoporotic. Now, this is a recent guideline. Everybody can get free online text. And this is my summary slide also. The risk factors assessment, clinical is very important. Then your calcium profile and vitamin D profile, if it is possible. Phosphate should be on a fasting state. Then you can decide also if the X-ray lateral spine and DEXA scan, if it is available. We can use fracture risk assessment tool online. OSTA you can do on your calculator. They are all simple tools. I like to thank, and I just wanted to give one word, please, what coming to Dr. Vijay Bhaskara's thing, like you can use calcium because many of our subjects do not take enough calcium. And if they have difficulty, we can supplement it. In addition, we can also supplement cholecalciferol, vitamin D for every woman after menopause. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Krishna Kumar, you can just take over. You're muted. Please unmute.
Yes, it's an excellent talk, sir.
Thank you.
By Dr. Thomas Paul. And only one question I wanted to ask him. Is it for postmenopausal people, is it safer? I mean, like Dr. Vijay has said about that, is it safer to give a calcium on a prophylactic scale, or what is SAR's opinion?
Sir, okay. Now we have an Indian Society of Bone Mineral Research as a body. We looked at a calcium thing. Except in Gujarat and Punjab, these are the two states, they take lots of calcium, dietary calcium. That is always best. But in Tamil Nadu, we have done 3 studies. They are all taking less than dietary calcium is 400 milligram or less, 80%. So the regular, it's like, if the dairy products are less, definitely there is a provision to use in all postmenopausal women at least 1 tablet of calcium carbonate, which is 500 milligram. 500 milligram is safe, and 1 tablet. And if somebody doesn't have bilateral renal stones, or it's not going to increase. We are saying 1000 milligram as a ceiling. We assume dietary intake is 400, and you give 500, it still makes 1000. We can go up to 1500, but we limit to 500. So the answer to that question, at 1 tablet of calcium carbonate, that's what we recommend.
Yes, sir. Yes. Any other questions?
Yeah. Dr. Thomas Paul, what is the role? Do you do PTH routinely in these places?
Yes, sir. So actually, PTH we don't do routinely, but if we are going to initiate anabolic agent, of course, Dr. Suresh and they are going to have a debate before initiating anabolic agent teriparatide. Definitely, we will do PTH to make sure that patient doesn't have secondary hyperparathyroidism. On a regular basis, if the calcium is normal, phosphate is normal, we don't do PTH, sir.
Okay. Is there any further questions?
There are a lot of questions from the chat box, sir. You can take
Yes,
the
sir.
questions.
Somebody's asked whether calcium with calcium channel blockers at the same time can be given at the same.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
No problem.
No problem.
And Dr. Rana has asked whether there is a difference in calcium levels in different forms of milks, in Tetra Paks, packet milk, etc.
See, as far as I remember, the milk is so far not, so all in trial basis in Gujarat, it's happening, and Delhi. Otherwise, the milk is not fortified. I'm not sure whether they are enriched with calcium. I'm not sure. The answer is I don't know. If anybody wants to say if they know the difference in the milk availability, I'm not sure.
Then Dr. Satish asks whether vitamin D supplement can be given to all adults without testing for vitamin D deficiency.
Yes.
Yeah. So we talk about postmenopausal women and elderly men. We say it's preferable to check calcium to with the albumin, corrected calcium, and to see there is no hypercalcemia. If it is vitamin D testing is expensive. In a village, we cannot do vitamin D testing. If the calcium is normal, mostly it is normal, then we can give 60,000 units, that is one packet, every month or once in 2 months. That is 1,000 to 2,000 units per day. Yes.
Dr. Jayashree asks, how frequently are you using bone turnover markers?
We use our center, we use for everybody for osteoporosis because we have a reference lab and we are using for everybody for treatment for osteoporosis. We are published also.
Dr. Prabhakaran asks whether calcium with calcitonin combination, how long can you use?
I have not heard of this combination, calcium with calcitonin. I just asked Dr. Reddy and the Dr. Rajesh if they have, and Dr. Suresh also there. I not that combination I didn't get. So you're saying calcitonin injection or calcitonin nasal spray?
I do not know. Even I've also not heard of this combination.
We don't use calcitonin nasal spray for
calcitriol. Maybe
calcium should be because calcitonin, there's an escape effect, and after 2-3 days, it's not working. So generally, it's not used anymore for osteoporosis.
Yes. Yes. Calcitriol, no. For osteoporosis, no. Dr. Vijay Bhattacharya very clearly told. Unless patient has got a renal disease, renal failure. Otherwise, we don't use active vitamin.
Okay. So I once again thank Dr. Thomas Paul for this excellent lecture. And now it's time for the next session. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Krishna Kumar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Now it's debating time, folks. And to participate in this debate, this is bisphosphonates versus teriparatide. And actually, two eminent speakers will be participating in this. First will be Dr. Suresh Prabhu, MBBS, MD, DNB Endo and CCT. He is presently designated as consultant endocrinologist in the Ganga Hospital, Coimbatore. He is a member of the ESTN and has 10 publications in national and international journals. And the second speaker will be Dr. M. Ravi Kiran, MD Internal Medicine, DM Endocrinology and Diabetes. He is consultant endocrinologist at Diaplus Endocrine Center near DLF Chennai and also the SIMS Hospital in Vadapayani in Chennai. He has very good work experience in internal medicine. He did his MD and senior residency in 2007 from the renowned Postgraduate Institute of Medical Sciences in Chandigarh. He's worked in Miyot Hospital, and also he's worked in the Agada Diabetes Center, and he currently is in SIMS Hospital, Vadapayani. He's authored a chapter on congenital adrenal hyperplasia in the Manual of Endocrinology and Diabetes, published by Endocrine Society of India. He has done projects on metabolic syndrome, in impaired fasting glycemia, glucose intolerance, and diabetes mellitus among adults in Chandigarh, and prevalence of goiter and its association with iodine, selenium, and thyroid autoimmunity in school children of Chandigarh. So we have two speakers, and it's the topic is indeed quite hot: osteoporosis. Of course, it's like two independent warriors, and sometimes both the warriors can join together in an alliance also. So which one first, which one second, we'll hear shortly. So first talk, bisphosphonates versus teriparatide for treatment of osteoporosis, first by Dr. Suresh Prabhu. Over to him.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind introduction. I began 1 minute, I think.
And just 1 minute. After each, the two speakers will be given time for their individual talks, and then a short rebuttal also can be there if the time permits.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I promise that the debate between the bisphosphonate and teriparatide will be a friendly fight, and we know that both the drugs are available in the market, and we know both of them are efficacy in treating osteoporotic fracture, and both have proven their mettle in terms of prevention of osteoporosis and also treatment of osteoporosis. So I'm not going to decredit teriparatide in my talk. I'm just going to present my evidence to show that why bisphosphonate should be the drug of choice for treatment of osteoporosis. We know that osteoporosis is an important public health issue which has a large economic impact. And according to estimate of Osteoporosis Society of India, 1 in 8 men and 1 in 3 women have osteoporosis. I think previously we heard Dr. Thomas Paul's talk that 50% of postmenopausal women in that area have osteoporosis. In spite of that, it is under-evaluated and treated. I think only 600 BMD machines are available throughout India for a population of 1.2 crore or 1.3 billion people. And the hip and spine fractures are important clinical outcome of osteoporosis, which is associated with increased mortality and morbidity. And we know that when a patient had a hip fracture, 10% of them may not see their next birthday, and another 50% of them need support to walk or support to mobilize after 1 year after. This is the impact of osteoporosis fracture, hip fracture. According to WHO, it is osteoporosis is defined as a disease characterized by low bone mass and microarchitectural deterioration of bone tissue, leading to enhanced bone fragility and a consequent increase in fracture incidence. And I think this Dr. Thomas Paul have discussed, this is the burden of osteoporosis. Up to 37%, that is in 2008, person have lumbar spine osteoporosis is a postmenopausal woman. Another 20% have femoral neck osteoporosis. And if you consider 20% of 3.5 crore Tamil Nadu females, it comes to around 66 lakh people have femoral neck osteoporosis, which increase the risk of fracture, and also it has its own economic burden. And these are the FDA approved treatment options. We know that it is divided basically into anti-resorptives and anabolic. And I'm going to discuss about bisphosphonate. I think Dr. Ravi Kiran will be discussing about anabolic therapy. Bisphosphonates, they are having a structure of PCP. They are stable analogs of pyrophosphate characterized by a PCP bond, and they get incorporated while taking, they get incorporated in the hydroxyapatite and taken up by the osteoclast. and they are released during resorption and impairs the ability to form a ruffle border and may modulate inhibitory signals from osteoblast to osteoclast, and also promotes the osteoclast apoptosis. So this is the reason why bisphosphonates are one of the commonest drug used in treatment of osteoporosis. And these are the relative potency and structure of bisphosphonate, and comparing to the relative potency of one of eridronate, the commonly used drug alendronate and zoledronate, if you see, is around 500 and 10,000. This is how these are the two commonly used drugs apart from the ibandronate and pamidronate. So bisphosphonates, they have a very poor oral bioavailability. Only 1% of the dose is get ingested, and the absorption is impaired for food, calcium, and iron. And that's the reason why we ask the patient to take the medication at empty stomach, and then they have to wait for 1 hour to take the next meal so that the absorption improves. And the bisphosphonates are quickly cleared from plasma, about 50% of deposit into the bone. So out of 100 milligram, if only 1 milligram get absorbed and 0.5 milligram is get deposited into the thing. The IV bisphosphonate should be given, particularly zoledronic acid should be given as an IV thing, and it is given as a slow IV bolus, or it can be given as a IV over 1 hour. So bisphosphonate have many indications apart from osteoporosis. It is indicated in Paget's disease, hypercalcemia of malignancy, osteogenesis imperfecta, metabolic bone disease, and Charcot's foot. So I just go into what should the ideal osteoporotic drug should have. We know that after metformin, which drug is better for, which drug is best for diabetes, and they have certain characteristics. I feel that these are the important characteristic of an ideal osteoporotic drug, and they should be effective in preventing osteoporotic fracture, which is the basic necessity of any osteoporotic drug. They should be effective in any stage of disease. It should have a durable action. It should have many approved indications. It should be very easy in administration. We know that if you want to treat 20% of our population, then it should not be a complicated one. Doesn't need a hospitalization. It should be given as an oral. So it should be easy to administer and should have less side effects, because when a side effect happens, patient tend to stop that one. And it should be cost effective, because we are treating it is a chronic disease. We are treating a large amount of population. It should be cost effective. So bisphosphonate have proven in prevention of fracture. I think that everyone knows that one. Both alendronate and zoledronic acid have proven in reducing the vertebral fracture by approximately 50%, and they also have effect on the hip fracture, around 40 to 70% reduction in the hip fracture incidence. But comparing to the head-on-head with teriparatide, if you see the meta-analysis of teriparatide with placebo, it is more effective in reducing the vertebral fracture. So compared to the zoledronic acid of 56%, it is around 74%. But the most important thing is it doesn't have a significant effect on the fracture hip. So that is what more important in our people, where fracture hip, even though on long-term basis it have shown effect, but it doesn't have a statistically significant reduction in the hip fracture risk. And another important thing is any osteoporotic drug should be effective in all stage of disease. So we know that it is a progressive disease, and the data I have given is the fracture incidence from Rohtak district from North India. And if you see, with increasing age, the fracture risk also increases and the fracture increases. So problem with teriparatide is we cannot give this medicine for more than after 24 hours or 24 months. So after 24 months, we have to withdraw, and probably we have to add on another drug. And this indicates that a drug which actually can be given in multiple times, and it can be given over a period of a longer duration, helps to maintain the bone density, rather than teriparatide, where it helps to improve the bone density for a shorter period of time, and once we have to switch on to another medication. So that's what I'm saying. They should have a durable effect. Bisphosphonate, or the distinct from other osteoporotic therapies in their positive effects, persist several years after discontinuation. And when the patient switched to placebo, and it was shown in the follow-up trials of alendronate and zoledronate, shows that even though there is a modest decrease in first 2 hours, and later it gets stabilized. And this is one of the important thing. This is the data submitted for the FDA. And if you see the thing I have just highlighted. So after 5 years, the alendronate was stopped and the patient was put on placebo. And if you see the fracture incidence in both the group is almost identical, and it indicates that the fracture preventing efficacy of the bisphosphonate persists even when we stop this medicine for some time. So that doesn't happen with teriparatide. And this indicates that in a mass treatment, we need to have a drug which have a long-term efficacy or a durability. So the anabolic therapy quickly increases the bone density, but it lasts after discontinuation. So teriparatide treatment, as per recommendation, should be followed by an anti-resorptive medication to preserve BMD. And this is so that there are several indications that I have already expressed, because teriparatide we can give only for one indication or two indications, but we have several indications for bisphosphonate, particularly the postmenopausal, apart from postmenopausal osteoporosis, the hypercalcemia of malignancy, osteolytic bone lesions, Paget's disease. But these are the conditions where bisphosphonates are contraindicated. So in condition where teriparatide cannot be given, we can give this medication. And regarding side effects, I think when we give these drugs for mass people, so it should have very less side effects. And if you see the side effect profile, when we give oral bisphosphonate, it have definitely side effects in terms of gastritis. But if the patient follow the precaution, they definitely have lesser side effect. And the flu-like symptoms with IV bisphosphonate is last for 1 or 2 days. And in our study, what we done in our thing, it was seen in only 5% of people, not in more than 95% of the most asymptomatic if they treat properly. And other side effects, what they usually mention is the osteonecrosis, jaw, and atypical fracture. But these are side effects, or these are the actions of the drug when we unable to follow up the patient, or when we give the patient without monitoring. So these are actually physician-oriented side effects rather than the patient-oriented side effects. So this is the comparison between teriparatide and bisphosphonate in terms of side effects. If you see, there is no statistical significant difference between the side effects between both the bisphosphonate and teriparatide. And since these drugs are given in a mass duration, they should have ease of administration. We can give these drugs in community. We cannot have an IV administration or a subcutaneous administration, or it need not have to stored in a fridge, where teriparatide should be stored in a fridge. So we can give this drug as a daily, weekly, monthly, 4 times a year, or once in a year. We have ease in administration, which is more suited for our community, particularly in Indian population. And finally, I think the pharmacoeconomics is more important in our population, because most of our people, I think I'll come to the data. This is the projection of Indian population. And in 2050, we are approaching 150 crore people. And out of which, around 500 million people will be above the age of 50. So the prevalence of osteoporosis will be around 20% into them. And we know that India is a country where most of the people live in rural population, and the economic divide is also too high, and shows that a drug which should be given in many of the people, it should have a cost effectiveness. As Dr. Thomas says, that the prevalence is high. With we should also have a pharmacoeconomics which should play a great role in treating this patient, particularly when we start this medication in government setting. We cannot afford a drug which costs more than 5,000 rupees per month, but definitely a drug which is affordable, at least 200 rupees to 250 rupees per month.
Dr. Suresh.
Yeah, this is my last slide, sir. This is my last slide. So bisphosphonates are treatment of choice for osteoporosis. They are effective and durable in preventing vertebral and hip fracture. They have comparable side effect profile with teriparatide. They have multiple approved indication, and they are cost effective and easy to administer. And I vote bisphosphonate should be the drug of choice for treatment of osteoporosis because of these effects. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh Prabhu. I now call upon Dr. Ravi Kiran to take his case.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for Dr. Suresh for clearly laying out the pattern. So I will be arguing in favor of teriparatide. We all know that bone remodeling is a continuous process. At some point, osteoclast keeps resorbing bone, macrophage clears the debris, then osteoblast lays down fresh osteoid, then it gets calcified, mineralized, then new bone is formed. So this is the sequence which is happening all the time in the bones. We know that there are two broad categories of agents: inhibitors of bone resorption, bisphosphonates come in that, and stimulators of bone formation, new bone formation, not just resorption inhibitor. PTH is the prominent agent which is available in India. Other agents are in investigative modality. Abaloparatide has been introduced recently in US. Romosozumab actually has a mixed effect, though because it has stimulation action, I have put it in the column of stimulators of bone formation. PTH, recombinant PTH, is the one currently available in India as stimulators of bone formation. So looking at this picture, we can easily see what happens to a bone with osteoporosis. This is a photomicrograph of iliac crest biopsy, healthy human iliac crest. We can see if afflicted by osteoporosis, the tubercle becomes thin, the bone mass becomes less. If we use anti-resorptive in this, it definitely inhibits further bone loss, but they are unable to restore bone matrix or architecture. So this is where anabolic agent comes in. Teriparatide is a human recombinant parathyroid hormone. Terminal part is used, 1 to 34. The continuous PTH causes more osteoclastic activation. In therapy, we use the phenomenon of intermittent PTH injection. So the intermittent recombinant PTH activates osteoblasts more than osteoclasts. There is net new bone formation. The osteoporotic thinned out tubercle have a chance to recover. The tubercle become thicker, and the restoration process starts if we use anabolic agent like PTH. So if we want to theoretically plot how the bone strength and density vary over time, we all know that with time the bone strength goes down, especially after 50 in female and after 60 in male. Bone strength is a combination of mass plus quality. Suppose if at the nadir of this bone strength, at 50 years of age or 60 years of age, we want to use either agent. Suppose if we use anti-resorptive, it merely preserves whatever is available at that time. 5 ரூபாய் இருந்தா 5 ரூபாய் அப்படியே இருக்கும், இல்ல 4000 ரூபாய் இருக்கும். Suppose if we use anabolic agent, there is a possibility that new bone is laid out, there is accrual of new bone, 5 ரூபாய் 7 ரூபாய் ஆகும் 2 வருஷம் கழிச்சு. So this is the simple highlight of difference between anabolic and anti-resorptive therapy. It is exemplified by analyzing the bone turnover marker responses. The red is formation marker and blue is resorption marker. When we use anabolic therapy like teriparatide, there is an initial isolated anabolic phase where there is no excess bone turnover. So this anabolic window is there between the formation, bone formation and resorption, which helps in net new bone laid. We can also see that the bone turnover becomes elevated for a period of 6 months to 1 year. After that, it hits a plateau. With anti-resorptive therapy, actually the bone turnover is lessened, depressed, suppressed. No new bone is formed, only whatever existing bone is preserved. So both bisphosphonate and recombinant PTH increase BMD, but by differing mechanisms. In recombinant PTH, new young bone is laid. It increases tubercular connectivity. Bisphosphonates merely increases mineralization of existing bone matrix, which shows up as increased BMD on DEXA scan. In effect, older fatigued bone accumulates after chronic use of bisphosphonates. That also leads to atypical femur fracture. So this is a pictorial depiction of how anabolic versus the resorptive agents act, anti-resorptive agent. With anabolic agent, there is prominent periosteal opposition. Layer after layer of new bone is plastered on the existing tubular bone. We can see the bone width itself increases, which increases the strength of the bone. It is balanced by increased endosteal remodeling. So the bone thickness remains same. However, the overall bone width becomes more. So it improves the bone strength and even improves the fracture rate. So the teriparatide indications by major world bodies are noted here. Treatment of postmenopausal women with osteoporosis at high risk for fracture. Increase of bone mass in men with primary or hypogonadal osteoporosis, and preferred agent in osteoporosis associated with systemic glucocorticoid therapy. So we'll see a few studies. This is one of the pivotal study. fracture prevention study, almost 1,600 patients, postmenopausal women with prior vertebral fractures. They are at higher risk for further fractures. We can see if there is only one or more new vertebral fracture, the incidence is much more with placebo as compared to teriparatide. The benefit becomes even more if women have many past fractures or severe fracture. New moderate or severe vertebral fracture is almost 90% prevented with use of teriparatide over 21 weeks in this trial, 21 months in this trial. The summary of this fracture prevention trial involving 1,600 patients, we can see absolute risk reduction in vertebral fracture is 9.3%, and non-vertebral fracture absolute risk reduction is 2.9%, from 6 to 3%. So overall, the relative risk reduction, even in non-vertebral fracture, including hip fracture, is around 50%. So which is considerable. So this is comparison with one of the bisphosphonates, risedronate, 24 months trial, around 700 patients. Here again, we can see the time to first clinical fracture is delayed with the teriparatide, clearly delayed with teriparatide as compared to risedronate. It is superior at the end of 2 years. And this is one of the well-known studies in glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis, teriparatide versus alendronate, approximately 200 patients in each arm. Teriparatide significantly increased BMD at lumbar spine and hip at all time points as compared to alendronate. And there were significantly lesser vertebral fractures in teriparatide group, 0.6 versus 6.1%, 10 times lesser vertebral fractures as compared to alendronate. Non-vertebral fractures were similar, statistically non-significant, that difference. And if we look at the comparison of different agents for vertebral fracture, commonly available agents, clearly teriparatide tops the list as compared to other bisphosphonates. Commonly, the concern raised with teriparatide is the data on hip fracture is limited because most studies are oriented on vertebral fracture as the primary outcome. However, if we collate data from several trials and look at the hip fracture data, again, we can see where placebo is used. Definitely, it benefits. There is a trend toward benefit with teriparatide. If we pull together all the patients, there is a clear benefit favoring teriparatide. Even where it is compared with the active comparator, active drug, we can see it is almost tending towards benefit for teriparatide as compared to active drug. So long-term data definitely tells that considerable effect is beneficial effect is there on hip fractures. So this is a very nice study. What they did cortical imaging with the CT, modified form of CT. In that they found, generally if we look at hip, the infromedial border of neck and the superiormedial border of neck, they have the thinnest cortex. You can see here yellow, red, and green. They have the thinnest cortex and they are more prone to fracture. However, if we use teriparatide, the cortical thickness improves. We can see here from red, it goes to green zone. So they clearly demonstrated that even in hip, where we feel that fracture rate may be more, teriparatide is beneficial. And second thing they noticed, the infromedial border of neck is the place where the effect of brunt of weight loading is taken. The habitual loading itself improves the bone strength at infromedial border of neck. As far as that aspect is concerned, increasing cortical thickness at infromedial border of neck, both habitual loading and teriparatide are synergistic. So if a patient is on teriparatide, if we encourage regular walking and do exercise, gentle exercise, the habitual loading has a synergistic effect on the teriparatide use. It has an additional benefit over teriparatide alone. So many trials have used teriparatide only for 18 months. Suppose if we continue to use for 24 months, in some trials what they have found, the change in BMD from 0 to 18 months is matched by whatever BMD change is there in the last 6 months. So we should
Dr.
always
Ravi,
use teriparatide for the full 24 months. Okay, sir. So, so coming to the summary slide, teriparatide versus bisphosphonate, which one to use first if both have to be used or teriparatide cannot be used later? Better to use anabolic agent for 2 years initially. It builds up bone mass. We can use bisphosphonate after teriparatide to preserve newly accrued bone. Skipping these slides. So what are the limitations and side effects of each agent? Teriparatide has to be given by daily injection. Cost was high, but is fortunately less with generics. 2 years use is permitted. Bisphosphonate can be used for 4 to 5 years, to limit fracture, atypical fracture rate. Side effects are generally rare with teriparatide. Osteosarcoma is almost unheard of in human subjects. Only 3 cases reported in 250,000 cases. Whereas osteonecrosis, jaw, and atypical femur fractures are significant side effects of bisphosphonates. Teriparatide is contraindicated in Paget's and prior radiotherapy to skeleton. So teriparatide indication, postmenopausal women, osteoporosis in men, and osteoporosis, preferred agent in osteoporosis associated with long-term glucocorticoid therapy. Summary, a strong anabolic agent, improves bone quality better than anti-resorptives, probably the best current agent for vertebral fracture risk, quickens fracture healing, reduces bone pain, and preferred agent in glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. Suppose if you have to put it in one word, teriparatide leads to young, freshly laid bone. Bisphosphonates in long term lead to fatigued, constipated bone. The choice is debatable.